Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Automated Advantage. Today we have Colin on. Why don't you just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your business?
Hi, Greg. Great to be here. I'm Colin Duff. Scottish, you might hear from the accent, and I'm CEO of Mosaic Innovation. We're a boutique innovation consultancy based in London but operating globally. And we really help clients surface insights others miss by we specialize in a method called jobs to be done, which I'll probably talk about as we go through. And we work with big enterprises, so HP, Marriott, BT, Prudential, that kind of client.
Yeah, no, that's so. Why don't you just tell us a little bit about how that all comes about? And I know it might be confidential, but you did tell me a story about the hotel chain doing something. I don't know if you're allowed to share that, but that type of thing, that's super interesting.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we've worked with Marriott as an example for the past, we've been going 6 years now, and we help them really, when they're looking to do something new and big or something isn't working. So, one example last year, Marriott as a group, they own about 30 chains from luxury, premium to select the budget tier. And they were looking at how do they take their premium and luxury brands into Safari in Africa, where they didn't have a presence. So we did everything from the kind of what they call market mapping, which is looking at all the players are literally every single person and property, or every player property brand, to how do those brands translate into Safari context, where it's more like tents and lodges rather than big hotels. What are the expectations and stuff like food and beverage? So you've got, like, for example, the Sundowner. Does the accommodation provider need to actually operate the safari? What about the ground transport, the logistics? So really thinking through from the bottom up, and then most importantly, actually, like, how do you win in that market? That's quite a mature space, and people are maybe a bit skeptical about some of those big brands where it's all about authenticity and nature. So how do you overcome those kind of objections? So that's like one example of a big project we recently did.
Yeah, no, that's exciting, and I can imagine that no project is the same and makes your day very interesting. Right? If you took that and plus working with HP, I've got to assume that very different.
Yeah, completely. And I know a lot of agencies do a sector focus. I think we're more around the kind of like human insight, unlocking new news. So, with HP, we've did really sexy stuff like the future of AI, to somewhat, if I'm honest, more prosaic, like how do you innovate in printing, which is still a big category, believe it or not. And, in that, maybe it's a bit more around intellectual stimulation, or actually like, getting stakeholders what they need to get to, rather than maybe newer to world stuff. And a lot of innovation is, sometimes continuous innovation of how do we optimize and squeeze out another 5 or 10%. But obviously, we have a slight bias towards the sector stuff when it's new to world invention.
Yeah. So you touched on you said methodology or whatever it is. So maybe just tell us a bit about how what it is and how you do it a little differently to some of the others.
Yeah, sure. So the main way enterprises, actually of all sizes, try and innovate, they use a technique or method called design thinking. And the first part of that, and by the way, it's a great method, is they'll usually do it some empathy. So if you were a Greg, the customer, and it was a lawnmower, I'd come in and ask you, I'd say, look, what do you like about your lawnmower? So we capture pains and gains. What would you like to see? And I'd watch you using it. And that's great for continuous improvement or incremental innovation, but it tends to, in mature categories, return the same insight. And often, actually, if we went to a competitor and they'd done the same study, it's kind of a carbon copy. What jobs to be done is looking at is what is the underlying goals and the particular circumstance you're operating under, and that can really reveal like really like fresh findings, unlock breakthroughs. So if I give you maybe the simplest example possible, imagine we were trying to innovate and it's a company making kettles that heat water. They'd probably be asking people, look, how can we improve it? And they'll say, oh, make it boil faster, filter the water, make it look cooler, etc. But if you think through the jobs to be done lens, on what is the underlying goal? It's to make a cup of coffee. And that's what Nespresso did. And say, like, how do we perfect that art? And it takes you in a completely different direction. So there's a whole series of like process tools, techniques that are very different from classic thinking of, this looking for the persona, like demographics and product, into actually looking at underlying goals and circumstance that gets you to radical new places. And I could talk about this probably all day and bore your listeners.
No, no, that's not boring at all. And I mean it's super interesting in the sense of you take the the hotel and HP, and then the kettle thing, which we talked about the other day too. And it's like looking at it from a fresh lens. It's like, when and for me, kind of it's in a similar way, kind of doing this business and talking to entrepreneurs. It's incredible how many things are out there that you wouldn't you look from a different perspective when you're doing what you do. I'm assuming that's very much the case for you.
Yeah, the great irony about innovation, and I've been in this space 20 years now, is how consistent and cookie cutter the approach is. And actually, why did I set up, the business? It's because I was working in Big Four historically, and I was really passionate this job's to be done. It originated at Harvard Business School, and there was a big article and a best-selling book about it. And I was trying to introduce it there, and they're saying it's a bit square peg round hole of, well, it's interesting, but it's not really what we do. And it's not like we're built for scale and repeatability. And I'm thinking, but that's shortchanging the client, because the obvious and approach isn't always the best one. Just being really smart and hardworking will only get you so far. It's how do you think in new ways. And that's why I left and set up Mosaic. So
You stole my segue there, but I mean that's interesting, right? Because you and I talked about this too. Come from the big consulting company, and I do think that there's a path to revenue in the sense of billable hours and things like that. And then talk about innovation, but I don't believe they're open-minded as innovation as what you're suggesting, and that's why you kind of say, okay, there's a different way to do this.
they're super, they're very hardworking, very smart, and in a more static context, very robust. So I definitely would hire Big Four to do your, looking at how you get that 10% linear style growth, or and you buy for safety. But if you were Marriott, we talked about earlier, I wouldn't rely on Big Four to come up with Airbnb as the next innovation, because the insight that was directing that, it was quite anomalous and weird. These people staying in each other's houses and stuff, and it's usually for innovation qualitative. And what happens is a lot of people who have done MBAs and they've came from Risen Up and finance backgrounds, they think very rationally and logically, and they value erroneously purely quantitative data. So there's a great strategist called Roger Martin, and he gives new C-suite executives advice. And he says, look, one thing you should consider, do a sommelier course. And they're like, well, why the hell would I want to learn about wine? And he says, because you've spent your whole career being taught that numbers and finance are the most important things. Being a great leader is actually about evaluating subjective qualitative data, which is what that is exemplified. And that's why, there's lots of other sayings like snow only melts from the edges. So, or no great marketing decision was ever made from quantitative data. So that's what we are saying is actually these smoke signals for the future, they're often quite anomalous, weird, they're hard to find. And a lot of the big traditional agencies, not just Big Four, even the research houses, what they've got a tendency to do is ignore those signals. They sand the rough edges off, and they're dismissive. And often, actually, it's people that are quite from a similar background. They've done MBAs, they've been, I don't know, very middle class, right? They have a kind of group think. And that's what we are seeking to challenge, is to think about, well, what are these kind of irregular things, the disconfirming evidence, or what are the context shifts that enable innovation, right? So if you said to me, even 3 years ago, before generative AI, someone's going to challenge Google in search, I'd just laugh out loud and say, well, that's impossible. But AI has actually changed the context from search to get an answer, and Perplexity et al. Have done it. So that's also what we're good at looking at. And we don't always get it right. Some trends are just fads, and it's very difficult to tell what's a fad and what's a trend, right? We do have some methods in that. But that's looking as well and helping the clients think about, to not think through this. And that's the horrible tendency in annual planning. Okay, we're going to grow 5%, 10%. Well, why could you not, if the shift is right, grow 50%? And in some categories that's possible, and some's not. And through that jobs to be done lens, as I mentioned as well, it really gives you radically new thinking. So if I asked you, what do you think about the dating apps market? Everyone's going to say it's saturated, right? There's so many players, there can't possibly be room. But if I ask you about from a job performance perspective, so how effective are they in finding me a date? And I say this as someone who's single perennially and has wasted more time than they'd care to admit. They're absolutely useless, right? I'm so frustrated. And with AI, the opportunity in that market to shake up and grow exponentially is huge, right? That's, my view. So by thinking about those, or thinking about like the circumstances, right, whereby you've got people that are maybe irregular types of daters, like maybe they've got like special needs, that's an underserved market. So they're all, or option is another great lens, right? Where people are looking at a market. Uber's a great example in saying, how can you justify when it launched this insane valuation, even if it gets 10%, 20% of the taxi market, it's not worth it. And you think, yeah, but you're assuming the market's fixed. You're not looking at the US suburbs where actually people just can't get a car, or you're not looking at what if it replaces 20% of the second car market, then actually then the valuation is looking very conservative. So that's the kind of perspective we try and bring.
Yeah, it's very, yeah, it's refreshing. It's like talking to my daughter and my nieces here right now. We're in their early, late 20s, early 30s, and I think that dating app thing is interesting, right? Like it's the perspective of how they want to go out and look for the right partner is different to when they were 20 to 30, and so maybe that's the angle. Whether to your point.
Yeah, and you look at the indirect competition, right? So people talk about sliding into your Instagram, so you get just messages from strangers like, "Hi, how are you?" And they're like, "Who is this?" And like, it's all a bit strange. So I think dating is a fascinating one, and I think that we in jobs to be done, we get this thing called related jobs, and I'd say one of the related jobs that no dating companies really doing is, how do you help me present myself better and actually, pardon me, be a better date? So there's a lot of people I've been in dates with, and I say, look, the problem's not the app, it's you, but the apps choose not to help the individual. And I'm not quite saying necessarily they should do therapy, or how do you stay in a relationship when there's so many adjacencies and more holistic ways to look at what is the role of these kind of things.
Yeah, no, that's what's super interesting. So maybe you said 20 years in business and things like that. I've got to believe that things have significantly changed from day one to day 20, year 20. Obviously we touched on AI, we touched on something, but like how has the your business changed and your outlook on change and how you have evolved and kind of run the business in 20 years? I got to believe it's very different.
Yeah, I mean, and my career's been atypical, and I started 8 years in a big energy company, and it was very traditional. I'm ashamed to say I used to wear a chalk striped suit when I started, and it was, everything was planned in advance. So using this kind of waterfall type thing, everything took years. It was all very like, if we did customer research, it was in a facility behind glass, and it was, super formal. And then I joined a funky agency where it was all like kind of an advertising agency style culture, and then Big Four, which was so I experienced all of these different cultures, which is rare because a lot of people, they do the same thing and in multiple industries. So that's why starting Mosaic, I was trying to bring a bit of the best of both, because you get all these biases like, oh, you can do creative, but you can't do commercial, or quant and not quant, and all that kind of stuff. So it was like, how do you do this more kind of holistic style thinking? But I guess when you think about how I've changed, and I'm not doing a good example today, I'm talking a lot, but I think, I used to probably be so keen to make myself the hero in front of clients. And also with colleagues, you're so keen to help, right? You're like, oh, you should do that, you should do that, you should do that. And obviously that probably went exactly as you can imagine, right? If you're monologuing for more than 2 minutes, you're selling less. If you look smart and the client doesn't feel smart, they don't hire you again. If you micromanage colleagues, and I like to say I wasn't micromanaging, but maybe I was, you get the results. I think the first couple of years of having my own business, it was so almost like stressful and high pressure that your desire to do the perfect job meant that you did a bad job in some ways. So I think probably the biggest thing in recent years is just chilling out a bit on stuff, and probably looking a bit more long term at relationships. So less being worried about do you win the individual deal, and more being about, okay, well, they like you, and you're, if it's a client, you're someone they'll call and invite to pitch, or if it's a colleague, right, okay, they might have a bad project, but do they want to work with you again, right? And do they learn? And that took me quite a while, because when you're really small, it hurts financially when there's a screw up, right? And it's like, oh, I've got a contractor and I've wasted 3 or 4 days. It's cost me a lot of money, but like that's life, and try to accept that. So I think that's lots and lots of changes.
And by the way, you're supposed to talk because I'm interviewing you and you need to share your story, so it's okay. Yeah, it's interesting that you say what you said in the sense of learning and listening to people. What I've found, and I was talking to a couple of people yesterday in a group setting. It's to your point about trying to be perfect and trying to do the right job. I have found, and I'd love your perspective on this, is authenticity in the sense of, look, you're going to do the best you can, but it's not always going to go perfect. And as long as you're open and communicative with the customer to say, look, it's not going as well as I thought, but here's what we're going to do to address it, and here's how we're going to adjust. Just communicate, and not sit in the background. And bad news doesn't get better with age, right?
Percent. I mean, on that point, like when I started my career, like as a gay man, it was still quite homophobic 20 years ago, right? I can remember, and that was something you hid, and that just made you inherently inauthentic, because even if someone says, "What did you do at the weekend?" you're thinking, well, what am I going to say? Because I can't say, "Oh, I went to a gay bar with this new guy I'm dating," right? So that, I think, probably the first few years, it like created a bit of distance with me and colleagues, and they probably, although I didn't think I was being inauthentic, they could sense it. Um, and then I think the other one for me is I'm a very candid person, and I think I always thought I've got now a little bit more. I think I don't like to use the word political. It sounds very Machiavellian, but I do think there is something in that it's maybe how you deliver like difficult news, and do you always be the one to deliver it, and letting the small stuff slide as well. Because I think, I don't know if it's my Scottishness, but we're very direct as a people, right? And like we call a spade a spade. And I think I've worked across quite a lot of cultures, and just in some cultures. So in France, you can be utterly brutal, right? That's what they expect, and say, Greg, that's a terrible idea. And it's just kind of normal. Try that in Japan, and one of you will probably leave the role the same day. So I think it's being authentic 100%, but also kind of being a bit dynamic to the, I don't know, the audience and the, yeah.
No, and I think that that's a really important point too. It's the cultural aspect of it, right? And knowing, and as whether you're working with a client or whether you're working with an employee, there's a different interaction perspective in who, what their culture is. I was talking to somebody yesterday, and I'm curious on how this resonates with you. But a German boss, one of the best that I'd had, super direct, but also said to me, look, I want you to tell me how you like to be managed. And he said, look, there's ways of doing it. You can say, I can call you once, twice, or 3 times a day to see how you're doing and ask you what you're doing. Or you can say, leave me alone, or whatever, something in between. And then the other piece of it was, when I called him, his first words were, he taught me to do this. I want you to listen, and I don't need your help. I just need you to listen. And second, the other one was, I need your help. And I've applied that in my life, and it's been an incredible learning experience for me, and understanding when I've managed people to go, it's actually very different on personality aspects of it. And so culture and personality aspects kind of tied together.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, we randomly a few years ago sold some innovation coaching to a client who had just spare budget, and it ended up being successful. We sold quite a lot, like hundreds of hours, which is not something I or the team had did. And probably, as you can imagine, actually, the innovation coaching a lot of the time just became general coaching and counselling, right? People saying, I hate my boss, right? And you're like, oh, okay, well, that's not really an innovation thing. So I had to try and learn, like, how do you actually coach effectively? And I read this great book by Michael Bugani Strainer, I think his name is. Really a simple book, but he said, like, the biggest mistake is, you giving advice, and like, to your point, like he would say, ask people, and then when they say, and what else, right? Or like, what, always on what's on your mind. That's why Facebook has that. And just listen. And a lot of the time, just the empathy, like that is really valuable. But it's hard, because I'll be, oh, Greg, you should do that. Have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? But that's often, you actually just want listening, or I'm not really going to understand the context as well as you, so it's very easy to just give, superficial kind of unthoughtful advice, which is definitely what I used to do and probably still do too much.
Well, and then into that interesting point too, because I'm about to in 2 weeks. I think I'll be married for 35 years. It's that age old taking. I learned very early on, which is why I think I've been married for 35 years, which is same. You want to jump in and solve the problem. It's the same as work. It's the same. Your wife tells you a story, and I learned early. She's like, "I don't want you to solve my problem. I just want to vent." And I'm like, "Okay." It's kind of the same as my boss saying, "Listen, do you want advice?" So I've applied both in life. It's definitely made a much healthier marriage for sure, and a better work life.
Well, you're a better learner than me, Greg, because despite telling you what I'm telling you today, I did not apply that lesson to a previous relationship. So I think that's why I'm single. I couldn't seem to learn that, sometimes your partner wants to just vent and your instinct to help is not welcome.
The other one I'll tell you really quickly, and this is not relative to business, but I've learned the lesson to say, when you're busy doing something and my wife was talking, and then I realized, oh, I should have been listening, and I've now copped to it. It's the honesty with the client as well, which is, honey, I just have to be honest. I wasn't listening. You're gonna have to tell me what you just said again, and it served me well. It's the degree of frustration, but at least the honesty comes out.
Yeah, I think it depends how much. My mum always says is selective hearing, which I agree, but so is.
So you've alluded to colleagues and things like that. So do you have employees, and or how does the structure of your business work
Yeah,
to
we've got a small team, and they are virtual actually because they're different geographies in the UK and beyond. And then we use quite a lot of contractors because our work is very like unpredictable. It's project based, and also the nature of it. So, for example, I mentioned recently Marriott work. We do work like an EMEA, so we don't have someone in the Middle East as an employee, but we do need someone who can do Arabic. Or, for example, in quantitative research, which is quite specialized, we have partners like who we work with, so that the business can really scale up at times and down as well. It's very very erratic. Which
Yeah, and I mean, I think the interesting part to that is best again coming from the consulting business is I think COVID helped us in many ways, helped us from consulting perspective figure out how to people to trust delivery from a remote perspective. I remember I was on a project. I was flying from Southern California to Atlanta, which is a 5-6 hour flight every Monday and every Thursday flying home. And within a week, we switched the model and nothing changed. And it literally changed the dynamic of the ability for big consultancies to deliver projects.
100%. And people like it as well, right? Because the people I work with are the regular ones as well. The check in might be weekly is typical, right? Unless something's going on, and let me know if it, and, if they want to work on their weekend instead, because a lot of the time outside the client meetings, they can work 12 hours one day and like how they manage their time. I think it's tougher. I think sometimes what I didn't realize we were doing a big project previously, and it was going really well. And then I spoke to this lady who I hadn't worked with regularly, and she was drowning and really not having a good time. And this all came out in tears like a few weeks into it. And I genuinely, because it's entirely virtual and because the work was really good and the client was really happy, had no idea. And she's saying, I'm having to do 12-hour days. I'm really stressed. I'm struggling. And I'm like, whoa, like you're doing a great job. Like, but you don't necessarily see that, which I think is sad. And then relationally as well. I think like if you are co-located and stuff, it is nice to have the kind of interaction which you miss. But I think you are much more efficient if you're virtual in some ways because you don't have those kind of. I mean, there's probably other distractions, but those kind of like interruptions as much.
Well, it's that, and these companies. I work for a guy that I felt like he wanted to see you just to validate that you're working. And my strategy has always been, I don't care. You can go sit at the beach for 6 hours of the day. Just get your job done and show your results, and you do what you need to
Well,
do. And
I mean, with AI now, especially, right? Because we almost always sell by um, project, but there are occasional clients. Oh, well, we'll pay you a day rate because whatever reason, and that's really tough now because I think, well, I wouldn't want to be penalised because in some areas we can just be so much faster, right? We're delivering the same value output. So I think there's a lot of people, just because we actually did research into AI as a part of project, who are using it under the table and not telling people now. And I mean, I'm as long as you're complying with like data security, if you're producing great output, I don't really care how you're doing it, right? In fact, I've said to people like you should be using AI because like what are you thinking? But I think even if you are to my point now together, you wouldn't really know what they're doing. So, and I've seen, I'm sure you've worked beside people before, and they sit around and they make personal calls all day and surf the web. So I mean, and then they tell you they worked a 10-hour day, and you think like, yeah.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I mean, and it's that what I what I've always tried to build in this is my first entrepreneurial run, but in doing this and working and leading teams has been that just generate the trust factor, generate an open communication, and it generally seems to work out. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the hardest thing in my business from the people perspective is we generally work with the same people, right? But occasionally you do have new people, and where it's particularly a contractor, and I've had situations before, it can be short, it's maybe only 3 weeks or something, and you're 3 days in and they produce nothing, and they're like, and it's, oh, it's give me a break and stuff, and I'm thinking, well, I know it's only 3 days, but like you're only on a 15 assignment, so like when are you going to produce it? And like, and I think that's quite a tough challenge, or people that again maybe are adapting to different standards or just styles. So sometimes quality, but actually sometimes it's just like, look, this client is very visually orientated, it needs to look as good as it reads, and so I'm like, oh, who cares about the slide format and stuff? Not them, right? Or this other client is fastidious about when you write a screener for who we recruit for market research, they're going to go through it with a fine tooth comb, it needs to be paired, and you're like, that term's too loose, and again, like, so it's or like some people again really don't like being challenged, and they're like, I've been doing this 20 years, and I think, but you're working in innovation. Like, I want you to challenge me and say there's a better way, or I disagree. I mean, I might not enjoy it in the moment, but a lot of people are not wired that way. But my other final, I feel as I'm venting now, I'm a grumpy old man. But I always say to people now, I'm like, see if I can just upload to AI and say improve this, and that's the only prompt I give, and it is better by more than 10%, you've done a bad job, right? That is a minimum standard I'd like you to do. And what I learned recently, actually, is particularly we do a lot of PowerPoint, is a lot of people were uploading the document and they were getting AI to review it rather than, for example, screenshotting every slide. And if you do that, you'll get a much more focused and richer like feedback, and the AI can read the visual, whereas it can't if you do the document. So I've learned, actually, because I'm a AI obsessive, that you kind of need to show people with that tool how to use it, because again, it's very different. It's evolving so fast.
Yeah, no, I mean, just we're getting close to the end of the time. You talked about contractors and stuff too, and what brought up my mind and the whole AI thing. Because in the previous role that I had, we were hiring people for jobs too. And vetting the real people in today's world from the what are they on AI or looking at a script when you ask them questions to find people that you can actually trust to do the work. I mean, is there a method you guys are doing, or do you have a trusted group of people you engage with?
So fortunately, as generally a trusted group of people, although that took a long time to build, right? So I mean, I have went through and there are just unpredictable times when something is a rush job or a rare skill set, and it is okay, like we have. I wouldn't ever do this now if at all possible, but I have just even used the platform before where it's like, oh, you can find a freelancer with mixed success, like brilliant and also terrible. I think the most reliable way for me I've found is no matter how good someone's CV, and I've had people that CVs are like, oh my God, this person's going to be incredible. They're ex, big tech, Google, they're so experienced, and it's almost insulting to ask them something like, oh, let's not get into detail. But I always say to them, like, let's see the closest piece of work you've got to this brief. I want you to show me now. And this is without any advance. So now, if they can't, so in one case, we were doing this project that involved visualization of dashboards. Like I said, there's nothing I can show you. And I'm okay, well, I'm ending the call because if you can't show me, like, I don't believe you. But then on the other stuff as well, what I've seen and sometimes is I'm like, okay, you've just approached that in a very different way to we would. Now we can talk about whether we can align, but it might be we can't because you've done that before, maybe in like, for example, a small business where it was super entrepreneurial and scrappy, whatever. And I'm like, okay, that's not going to translate to enterprise. Or you've done it in a, I don't know, like maybe a very McKinsey style where you've got very dense 100 slide deck. Show me something with better storytelling. And well, that's the way I write slides. And I think, okay, well, for this client, well, they don't really want that. So that's the only reliable indicator. I'm not saying I'm hung up on the document. I don't want you to mislead you, but I do find like if you asked me, I mean, it might be polarizing whether you think it's good or not, but but okay, well, and I can talk. And then I always ask them as well to make sure they did it. I'll ask like the questions you can't really prepare for and say, okay, what were the other strategic options that you discarded and why, right? Or what was your like most surprising insight on this project? And those things are just harder to manufacture. So if it's all like, because sometimes people come prepared and they've got okay a story, so you need to try and break the thought process in, and they can't use AI in literally in the moment if you're speak at the speed
Yeah,
I
no,
speak
and I
at.
think it's a good point. It's a balance between technical and the true. I mean, if you're in consulting, there needs to be a personal component of it, and I like that aspect of give me some examples, or be specific about this. That's not, I don't want to know that you can do this, and then on a technical perspective, I want to understand how you help, how you manage the situation or whatever it is. It's way
I mean,
more.
yeah. One question, and I'd be criticised for this, but this is more permanent recruitment, as I've said to people, like, tell me about the last time your work was ripped apart by somebody, and specifically what was the problem, why was it so bad, and blah blah blah. And I've had a couple of people say, "Oh, but that's never happened to me. I'm really good at the job." And I think, well,
Yeah.
it's happened to me, not loads, right, but over the years, and it's painful, and you remember that. And if that hasn't happened to you, and I believe some people, I don't think you've been operating in a high enough environment. So if you work in Big Four, and I can remember a specific instance, somebody said, "This is shit. You need to redo it, right? What the hell?" And it was, you'll never forget it, right? You don't want to go through it. If you haven't had that, and some people, particularly in Sleepy Enterprise, when we meet them, I'm like, I don't know if you like when if it did ever happen here because you're permanent, like would you survive it? Or are you going to become really defensive and say, oh, blah, blah, blah. So we had a mishire of a partner actually about 3 years ago, and he'd worked in the same company for years, and that was the problem. Is he's actually was really smart, his work was good, but whenever we said, look, he really did not like it at all. It wasn't in an aggressive way. He just was not used to challenge. What he's like, I've been doing this 20 years now. I've always had really good feedback, and like, well, the client doesn't like the style you're doing it. You need to change quite fundamentally, and he did not want to do that, and that did not work out.
Yeah. Then I think the other one is my boss is an asshole, right? Like hey, it wasn't me, it was them.
That's fine as long as it's not every boss, right? And then it's like, oh, there is a. I know somebody, and it's like, oh, every time it's one of my friends, and every time they get a job, which they've had many, is a toxic workplace, and I'm like, at some stage, what you're describing just sounds like a normal workplace.
Yeah, exactly. Well, this is very enlightening. We're getting to the end of time. So tell us again, name of the company, website, LinkedIn, whatever it is you want to tell
Yeah,
everybody.
sure. So we are Mosaic Innovation. It's mosaic-innovation.com. Our specialism is say jobs to be done. So if you want to try and unlock new customer needs, find out where those hidden opportunities and underserved things are, we've got the number one toolkit on jobs to be done. So if you know what that is, download it. We just ask for an email. You can follow me, say Colin Duff on LinkedIn, or just search Colin Duff Innovation or Jobs to be Done, and I'll appear there. And I love talking to people and meeting new people.
Oh, this is awesome. I appreciate the time, and this I'm looking forward to posting this episode so people can
Yeah.
get the wisdom.
Pleasure. Thanks, Greg.